Folks, a lot has been going on over the last 24 hours. Patrice Bergeron has signaled his retirement, and suddenly the need for an elite number one seed for a team that is, quite frankly, still trying to compete and remain a Stanley Cup contender has been amplified. And lo and behold, guess who might just have one available on the market? Well, it might be the Winnipeg Jets, and we'll talk about why Scheifele to Boston continues to look like a potential possibility, and also dive into some other fun stuff from our top 10 biggest offseason rankings from the Locked On Podcast Network.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always completely free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But more than anything, we just really love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more and visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Now, like I said at the top of the episode, we've got two main things that I want to focus on tonight. The first is, of course, the changing Mark Scheifele market. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, so I just heard that Patrice Bergeron is retiring. How does this really impact the Jets? Well, like I said before, probably, maybe a month ago, it was kind of becoming apparent that Patrice Bergeron might not be long for the Bruins. He's spent a pretty good amount of his professional career in Boston, and I think at this point he was ready to hang up the skates, and it became clear that he might not be coming back for the next season, which for the Bruins, while, certainly an extremely awesome moment for him to hang up his skates as a lifelong Bruin, and certainly I'm sure the fan base adores him and respects his decision. In the immediate future, that puts Boston in a really tight spot because, let's be real, they don't really have a center after him. You've got Zacha, and I don't even remember who else is on their center depth list. Maybe Coyle or something. I don't even remember what Coyle's been doing these days. But long and short of it is that center depth becomes a real problem immediately. And so for the Bruins, they've got to find an external solution for a first-line center. And as it just so happens, the Jets might just have one. I think the biggest problem for this whole trade is that, say the Jets were to send Scheifele to Boston, where the sticking point really lies comes in from the return, right? What exactly are the Bruins going to give the Jets that would make us happy? The reality is there's not a lot, and I think it would probably start with Jeremy Swayman. Swayman is an intriguing young goalie who, if the Jets were to acquire him, might give Winnipeg the impetus to then send Hellebuck to New Jersey, right? Obviously, Jeremy is also a restricted free agent, so he's needing a contract extension. I think for Winnipeg, getting a goalie in return for Scheifele as one of the main pieces of the deal it's okay. I mean, it's not great. It doesn't really immediately solve Winnipeg's problem of having reduced center depth immediately. So, yeah, not ideal. But if you were to get Swayman and then, I don't know, Trent Frederick and some sort of a pick or something, maybe you could kind of talk yourself into it. I think with the Scheifele market increasingly becoming, one where the offers for a rental haven't exactly been where the Jets have wanted them, it does make you wonder if it's really worth moving him out right now, or perhaps looking at this more as a trade deadline move. But my guess is the Bruins are going to be shopping pretty aggressively for a center. There's just no way that they can go into the season with Pavel Zacha and whoever else is on that roster anchoring your top six middle, right? That's just not going to really cut it, especially with the Bruins kind of having mortgaged everything on these next couple of seasons. Boston has all of the reason to really chase a quality rental center. So I think for that reason, I would not be shocked if the Scheifele trade somehow happens. If it does, I kind of feel like Winnipeg would go to New Jersey and maybe look to not only send Hellebuck there, but some sort of a plus that perhaps gets you Dawson Mercer. Mercer would kind of fill in for somewhere in like the top six center role. I don't know which line it would be, maybe the first or second. My guess is if you were to have the first, it'd probably be like Vilardi up there. And then the second line is maybe Perfetti or Mercer down the middle. I know that the Jets are kind of talking about, where Cole Perfetti is going to play long-term for his career. So, obviously there's a lot of options, but I think the Jets mainly want, some immediate impact players. And, I wonder if they'd be willing to pay a little bit more if it kind of helps grease the wheels on this whole trade cycle. Because I think if you're just getting Swayman and like a modest winger or something back, it doesn't really make as much sense to trade Scheifele because then you'd have to kind of trade Hellebuck, right? You can't really go into the season with three goalies of those, of that caliber with Hellebuck, Brossoit, and Swayman all on your roster. Winnipeg just wouldn't do it that way, and I'm pretty sure, Helly would probably be on the move immediately. So a lot of stuff to mull over. I mean, while the market I do think has changed pretty significantly in terms of the demand for a 1C, I do also wonder if it's going to be the Jets that actually make Boston a happier team. I don't really know who else would even suffice to fill that void. You can't replace Bergeron. And the reality is, there's just not many other centers that are either rentals or in Boston's price range that are going to be reasonably good. Scheifele is probably one of the most affordable per bang for your buck kind of centers out there. And I really do think that if he goes to Boston and he plays alongside Pastrnak, it's going to be lights out. I mean, there's no question for me that Scheifele is going to remind people of why he was thought to be one of the best centers in the NHL just a few years ago. And it won't even take that long. I think he'll fit in almost immediately. And, the reality is the Jets are probably going to be made to look like fools, and people are going to ask, well, why did you ever trade him, right? So it's a dicey road. But let's hope that the Jets, if they do trade Scheifele to the Bruins, get at least a pretty good return coming back, because as it is right now, it doesn't seem like, despite the demand being there, that the actual trade returns are looking all that great. Now, speaking of offseason trades, Locked On did a ranking of a top 10 most impactful offseason moves list, and let's just say I've had some thoughts on this ranking. I forgot to vote myself, so apologies, but we'll go into like the top five for each, or top five, and then the back five in just a little bit, and talk about whether these moves are really that much, are really that important and really move the needle, or if our network kind of got it wrong. But before we go through all of that, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get up to 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets. That is up to $200. That's right, just bet $20 and you will land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. And for those of you who are Jays fans, you might even think about betting who you think is going to finish at the top of the AL East. As an Orioles fan, I could tell you it's going to be the O's. I'm just saying. But, whether you're a Jays or an Orioles fan, you can be sure that you're betting on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Hello, friends. Welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. We are just talking about off-season moves and stuff, and the Scheifele market has maybe moved a little bit, but our network put out a call, and I apparently missed it, but there was a vote for top 10 most impactful off-season moves across the NHL. And I'm going to tell you right off, in this top 10, the Jets are not featured. And I can tell you, I got to disagree. If the Jets, especially with the acquisition of Gabriel Vilardi, how that doesn't rank in the top 10 is really shocking to me. But let's go through the top 10, starting with the top 5. So the first move is going to be Alex DeBrincat to the Detroit Red Wings. And I don't necessarily take issue with this being in the top 5. I don't know that this is necessarily first overall. I think this is obviously a quality move for the Red Wings. And based on the price that the Red Wings paid, obviously for the trade package, really good value, right? I don't think DeBrincat really cost much more than a first and some parts that the Red Wings probably weren't too upset about moving and exchanging. And in return, they're getting a guy who's a really quality top 6 scorer and basically on paper improves the Red Wings scoring output tremendously. Now, I guess the question is, does DeBrincat move the needle enough to make the Red Wings a real threat? And for me, the answer is no, not yet. That team still, for me, has a couple of contracts that I don't really care for. And just in general is kind of like on the mediocre side, right? You look at that roster and you kind of realize compared to a team like, say, Vegas or maybe even some of the Eastern Conference teams that they'll be going up against, Detroit is still kind of in that mushy middle of mediocrity. Now, maybe they surprise us and really go on a run, but I think this year it's going to be a step forward. I just can't really see it being that much more than like a step forward and the sign of growth. I feel like DeBrincat is a nice quality boost to a team that certainly hasn't had the biggest of offensive jumps over the past couple of years, but I feel like while still really good, he's not quite what you need to push yourself into the elite upper echelons. Now, the second move that has ranked is the Kings getting Pierre-Luc Dubois. So funny enough, the Vilardi trade actually is mentioned, but not exactly in the way that you'd expect. Now, Dubois going in at second overall, I feel like is fine in my mind. I think obviously PLD is probably the biggest offseason acquisition. And, for me, when Dubois is on his game and playing at the elite level that we know he can, we have seen him do stuff that just no one else in the Jets has really been able to attempt, right? He's got that huge, strong frame, a great shot, great hand-eye coordination, excellent stick handling. The guy is immensely skilled. But the question is, when are you going to see that on a consistent basis? And that is kind of where the sticking point has traditionally been with him. There's zero question that he's an amazing player. It's just you don't really see it enough to consistently feel like you're getting the most out of him that you can. And I think towards the end there, when he was kind of ready to call it quits for the Jets, it just wasn't really noticing him on a frequent enough basis for me. I feel like he was there and present, but it was more like I'm just kind of here so I don't get fined. And that's probably not the most fair assessment of his time. I think on the whole, he did some really great stuff for the Jets. And I also feel like at times his reputation was unfair. But, towards the end there were some moments where I was like, okay, Dubois, I kind of need you to pick it up. But as a number 2 ranked offseason move, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think he could even arguably be the biggest acquisition because of how he now shapes that LA King center depth. They are going to be a real threat this year and probably a pretty exciting team to watch. Now, coming in at third overall is the Carolina Hurricanes signing Dmitry Orlov. And I guess it really depends on what version of Orlov Carolina's getting. As a really quality top pairing left-handed D with a monster shot, Orlov has been, for me, one of my favorite skaters on the blue line in the NHL over the last few years. And I feel like he really just somehow doesn't really get any sort of recognition. I feel like this is a really big boost to Carolina's blue line. But the thing with Carolina's blue line is that traditionally it has always been good. I mean, they've not had a ton of weak links. So I don't know that this is going to be the move that really pushes them into, going from being a deep playoff run team to a full Stanley Cup winner. But I guess if you're trying to load up and really chase after it, this is certainly a pretty solid acquisition to make. I wish Orlov could have played for the Jets at one point, but that is just not happening. Now, the Toronto Maple Leafs come in at number 4, signing Tyler Bertuzzi. And, Bertuzzi, for all of his not-so-great reputation, is a pretty effective, middle 6 winger with, a lot of sand and sandpaper and grit. And, offensively, he's no slouch. I mean, he's put in some pretty big numbers over the past few years, especially for a guy who traditionally people thought was just kind of a rabble-rouser. But turns out he actually has a pretty good knack for getting into tight areas and punching the puck past goalies. So I feel like if you're looking at this move in isolation, it's fine. It's been part of this thing where the Maple Leafs are really trying to bring in big personalities with a lot of physicality, as if that's kind of what they're missing to put them um, on the path of like a deep playoff run. And I feel like they're maybe missing why the Leafs have kind of been losing playoff runs. And, I don't really feel like this is going to be the move to push them over the top. But as an acquisition, I mean, it's okay. I'd actually say that the move that got ranked afterwards is a bigger deal. Dallas has brought in Matt Duchene, and Duchene I actually had forgotten had signed for the Stars until people kept saying, oh, there he is on the list. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right. That did happen. Duchene, he got bought out by Nashville, and then he moves to Dallas. And I think for the Stars, he's going to be really quality. I think they get an immediate boost to their top six. I think he'll slide right in behind Sagan and as like a 1-2 punch for Dallas, which is an aging team. And, Duchene's not going to make them younger, but I think in terms of effectiveness, skill, and the ability to be a really solid two-way presence down the middle with, not game breaking, but certainly a lot of high-end playmaking skill. I think that this is a really smart acquisition. I feel like it's surprisingly not been talked about much. And I think for the Jets, it's actually kind of a problem because Dallas is just continuing to get deeper with guys like Pavelski, who's still really good, Robertson, who's amazing. You've already got Sagan, who's still pretty decent, Ben, who's kind of turned his career around a little bit recently, and now you add Duchene with a lot of veteran experience and skill down the middle. It's going to make the Stars even more annoying to play against, and Duchene has developed surprisingly some pretty good defensive habits. So I would actually put this one above Bertuzzi. I think that's a really big acquisition, maybe even above the Orlov signing, but there are 5 more rankings, and these are where you start getting into even more controversial territory because you're going to realize that somehow Vilardi didn't even make this list. We'll dive into who the next 5 big offseason moves are in just a moment. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's show as we are diving into the top 10 biggest offseason moves as ranked by our Locked On Podcast Network colleagues. And like I said, I don't entirely agree with the rankings. At number 6, though, I think this is actually a really good one to call out. It's Tyler Toffoli going to the Devils. Toffoli basically went to New Jersey for peanuts, and for a Devils team that was looking for a quality top 6 scoring upgrade, Tyler, for the price that he came out of Calgary, was dirt cheap. I'm a huge Toffoli fan. I think that he's got so much skill. He's great in transition. He's very crafty in tight spaces and immediately slides into their first or second line as a clear upgrade. It's just a really smart move. And honestly, if you're talking about wingers, he probably is one of the biggest ones to get traded and acquired. I would put him probably on par with the DeBrincat move. And I think it's not really going to be talked about in that way. I think it's going to go under the radar, but I promise you Toffoli, it's going to light it up for the Devils. After him came Ryan O'Reilly to the Predators. This one I just don't really care about as much. I mean, O'Reilly a few years ago would have been a very different story, right? Moving to the Preds, he'd make them significantly better down the middle, would probably slide into their first line almost immediately. He might still at this rate because Nashville's depth is really poor right now. But in terms of actually moving the needle, I think at this stage of his career, probably not. I think O'Reilly is an all right enough player, but age is catching up, and I think his ability to be that dominant center in both defensive work and offensively, I think those days are probably done. Coming at number 8 is kind of an interesting one because this one is a really big gamble signing from Colorado, but it's the Ryan Johansson move. This trade, I mean, Johansson, I guess you're betting on him, A, staying healthy, and B, still having something left in the tank. I don't know if Johansson is really going to be that much of a needle mover for the Avs. I feel like he does give them a quality middle 6 center, and I know that sounds crazy to say middle 6, but based on where Johansson is at the stage of his career, I just don't know if he's going to be much more than that. I think if you put him on your second line, that's probably where you want to cap it. I don't know if he can do much more than that. Certainly, I would not ask him to play on the first line. Anyways, they've got McKinnon, so that wouldn't really even be a consideration. But second or third line duty probably makes more sense. At number 9, you've got Carolina signing Michael Bunting. Bunting is, again, like a fine enough middle six attacker. I think he really carved a name out for himself with Toronto and Arizona, and I think, the reputation has been certainly impressive, but I feel like Bunting, for me, it's the kind of signing where he does improve Carolina technically, but I feel like where the Canes really want to add is an elite finishing, and Bunting doesn't necessarily fix that. But again, if you're trying to make small, modest gains around the roster at prices you can afford, it could be worse. Now, the final ranking kind of caught me off guard. It was Ryan Graves to the Penguins, and obviously he did sign a pretty expensive contract. I just don't really know why this one really made the list and why Gabriel Vilardi somehow didn't. For me, Vilardi should have been well over most of this list. I'd actually say that he'd probably be up there in the top 3 biggest acquisitions. I feel like for some reason the Locked On group just maybe either missed or didn't really realize just how good Vilardi is, and that is kind of going to be a big thing, I think, for the Jets, and maybe why this 2-year deal that he signed is not going to end well for Winnipeg, because my guess is if he does play this out, he's going to look like a superstar center. I'm really excited for Vilardi. I'm shocked that Graves made the cut, but somehow Vilardi didn't. I think that is a big miss. And I think Vilardi would probably, for me, again, like I said, slide into the top 3. You could argue that if you had Dubois at first, Vilardi should probably come at number 2 and then maybe DeBrincat. That's like a pretty solid top 3 move. But for all of these acquisitions, you do kind of think about it and you wonder how many of these teams have actually really gotten better. Dallas, I think you have a pretty fair argument for. Carolina, probably. LA, it's questionable. It does help them consolidate contracts, but in terms of actually taking that next step forward, I don't know yet. We'll see. For the Jets, I think what they got back in return for Dubois easily upgrades the team. I think there's zero question that Winnipeg's forward grouping got better. So if you're a Jets fan, you are loving life. But let me know, based on what you've heard here with these rankings, how you might arrange them. Any other big offseason moves that you think are worth shouting out in the top 10, drop your thoughts below in the comments section or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We will see you back here tomorrow with more offseason coverage, so don't go anywhere. Like, follow, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.